Excellent. A lively crowd this evening. Fantastic. How are we all doing?
Good. Good.
Excellent. Well, it's a real privilege and honour for me to welcome you to tonight's public lecture. Society, the community, health and well-being, challenge and opportunities in a digital age. Such a snappy title. So we'll cover some housekeeping first. So I'm Gillian Doherty, I'm the Chief Exec of the Data Lab, one of the innovation centres, and it's my pleasure to be your host this evening and grill Harry at the end of his presentation, with your help of course when you ask your interesting questions. But some housekeeping: there is no fire alarm planned. We have exits at the front and at the rear, and we will be guided to the muster point. We are streaming the talk tonight live, and therefore we'll be using a bit of digital technology to solicit questions both from you, the audience, and you will have a choice of either submitting your question online or putting your hand up and getting access to a microphone. But this offers the chance for those that are potentially watching online, hello to those, to also ask questions this evening. So tonight's public lecture is part of a concluding event of the 2-day Digital Health and Care Festival that's ran for the last 2 days here. I think over 1,000 participants, 40 odd sessions, really tackling some of the challenges and the opportunities as well that we have in the health and care sector. So I think the teams involved, Margaret, Vanessa and Nicola, have had a fantastic time, and some of you may have attended the last 2 days as well. So well done on your stamina staying along for this evening. So in terms of the technology, we are going to be using menti.com. It's a little bit like Slido. We'll ask some questions of you, the audience, as well, but we'll also give you the opportunity to ask some questions. So I believe that those who did register, you should have received a link, so you may already have menti.com ready to go. There is the Wi-Fi code, so Wi-Fi is TIC conferences. Signal in the room's not particularly great, so you might need Wi-Fi with the password Glasgow Green, no spaces, 2 capital G's. And when you then get onto menti.com, there is a meeting number 997714 to log into the session for this evening. And when you do that, you will be asked the first poll of the evening. So we're going to get you involved really early on. And it's an easy question. It's where are you from? And what role you currently have. So when you get online, those questions will pop up. If you're from the health sector, the care sector, voluntary sector, housing, policy, education, research, tech supplier, general public, student or other. And for those watching on the live stream, please fill it in as well. So we're going to go live to these results just now. Oh, we're getting some love hearts. That's 28. Here we go. It's great when the technology works, isn't it? Oops. It's going back to me. There's the back button. There we go. So we have a reasonable mix tonight for you, for Harry. Still a few more coming in. So while those are concluding, as I said, when Margaret and Nessa asked me to come along this evening to provide the introduction, I was very honoured because I've been kind of stalking Sir Harry online and listening to his talks, and I went online to get a few tips, and 6 hours later on YouTube, 8 YouTube videos, 2 in the morning, I thought I better get to bed. I'm learning all about this wellness, and I actually ought to get a good night's sleep. But you're in for a huge treat. Professor of Global Public Health here at the University of Strathclyde, formerly Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, started here in Glasgow as a surgeon, and then decided to unravel the science behind wellness. And so, as I say, we're recording and broadcasting tonight and therefore this will add to your YouTube greatest hits this evening. I'm sure of it. So I think we are pretty much there. So thank you all. You've got the menti.com thing going. We're 27% health, 19% student, voluntary sector, a good mix of research, policy and education. So a real good mix in the room this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sir Harry. Please give him a huge welcome.
Thanks a lot, Julian. So I'm not going to try and pretend that I know anything about digital stuff, okay? I do know a wee bit about it, but it's likely that you will all know a lot more about it than me. And it would take far too long to go through this and describe to you what seems to be the cause of well-being in our society, and then talk about potential digital responses to that. I'll leave that for you to think about after the lecture. But the point I want to make is that well-being, most of us, our concepts of well-being are probably wrong, okay? As a medical student, it was clear to me that well-being was not being ill. Doctors are taught that the absence of illness or infirmity is the key thing. And therefore we have this mental image of well-being as a pathogenic area. Try and stop people becoming ill and everything will be okay. In fact, that's the World Health Organization definition of health, a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, not merely the absence of illness or infirmity. That was coined in 1948, and thinking has moved on a good bit since then. And the question for tonight is well-being just simply a matter of preventing illness, or is it creating wellness? And I'm very much in that second camp. So the public health view, as I was taught it, was that you could imagine health and well-being, and the NHS particularly, as being like someone who lives in a wee house at the bottom of a river where there's this dangerous waterfall. Just as a wee digression, a few years ago I was made an honorary fellow of the Royal Incorporation of Architects of Scotland because I talked a bit about place in health, and asked an architect, so what does being an FRIAS allow you to do? And it says, it allows you to draw pictures of wee hooses and sell them for a fortune. So if anyone wants to buy that, let me know. So the idea is that the health service basically is like the man who lives in that house, and he sees people drowning and he comes out and rescues them, pulls them out the river. And public health comes along and says, why are all these people in the river? Wouldn't it not be a lot better if we wandered upstream and found out why they were falling in the river and stopped them falling in the river? And that was the kind of idea that I grew up on in public health, and it's probably still prevalent out there. But it's the wrong paradigm. It's far better to think of us all being in the river all the time. And the river has two sides to it. On one side you can float along in the sunshine, there's a guy handing out beers and mojitos and things like that, and you can have a nice time. But on the other side of the river, if you drift over there, you've got crocodiles and sharks and rocks and so on. The challenge is not to avoid falling in the river, the challenge is to learn how to navigate once you're in. We're all going to be in there, we can all get problems all the time, we have to learn how to navigate our way through it. So a better definition of health, which has appeared more recently, is this. Environmental scientists describe the health of the earth as a capacity of a complex system to maintain a stable environment. So they proposed the formulation of health as the ability to adapt and self-manage, the ability to navigate that river. It's how we respond to events round about us that determines well-being or not. So the journey that unfolded in my head was, first of all, to try and understand what it was about our health. And this is what persistently the newspapers tell us, that we're a basket case, we're very unhealthy because we smoke too much, eat the wrong kind of food, drink too much, and if only we would get a grip, everything would be fine. Folk recognise that as being broadly what they're told. Well, actually, only one of those statements is true, and for those of you hoping to hit the pub after this, I'm afraid it's the one about the drink, okay? The rest is not true. This is life expectancy in 16 Western European countries going back to 1851, 160 years worth of data. For most of that time, Scottish life expectancy has been at about the European average, except since about the 1950s, when we've drifted to the back of the pack. And if you look at the rate of growth in life expectancy in the richest 20% of the population, not the top 1%, the top quintile, they've done that, and the rate of growth in life expectancy in the poorest 20% of the population has been much slower. The reason Scotland's health is, relatively speaking, poorer than the rest of Western Europe is a reflection of the health of the people at the lower end of the social scale. And it's not because of smoking. This slide shows smoking rates in 15-year-old teenagers in the various countries of the European region of the World Health Organization, and Scots teenagers are the 5th lowest smokers in Europe. And Scots men, similarly, no, that slide's obviously disappeared, but I've got Scottish men in a study carried out in Europe, 3rd lowest smokers in Europe, beaten only by the Finns and Swedes. Scots women closer to the European average, but we're not where we are because we're the worst smokers in Europe. What about diet? Okay, so the big study that was done on diet was done in the North Karelia region of Finland in the 1960s, where they had this very high rate of heart disease, the highest anywhere in the world. And the Finnish Institute of Public Health decided that this was due to fat, and the Finnish government decided they were going to change the Finnish diet. So I once asked the director of the Finnish Institute of Public Health how he managed to change the Finnish diet, and his response was, and this is verbatim, well, the Finnish Institute of Public Health told the Finnish government what to do, the Finnish government told the Finnish people what to do, and the Finnish people did it. And I said to him, well, that's us stuffed, because we never do anything anyone tells us. So what they did was they took subsidies away from dairy farmers to discourage them from producing milk, butter, cream, cheese, etc., thereby making the Finns the most miserable people in Europe. And they gave them the subsidies back if they'd switched to growing fruit and vegetables. And they made free fruit and free salads compulsory in all schools and workplaces. And then they stood back and said, wow, aren't we clever? That yellow line there shows a steep decline in heart disease deaths in men under the age of 75. They did something, and something happened, so they said, that's happened because we did that. But at the same time as Finland was doing that, that pale green line alongside it is the Scottish heart disease mortality in men under the age of 75. At a time when the Finns were radically taking fat out their diet, the Scots were inventing the deep-fried Mars bar. And yet we saw the same decline in heart disease. The Finnish conclusion was false. It was association rather than causation. They did something, something happened. Two things were associated, but one wasn't causing the other. So what caused that decline in heart disease, which really happened in every high-income country? In the 1960s, that was the decade when men started to give up smoking in huge numbers. In the 1960s, 1 male death in 10 in Scotland was due to lung cancer. And gradually that all disappeared as the message about smoking got out. So it's not diet that's causing our problem. So a colleague at Glasgow University began to tease out what was causing this inequality. He took death rates in each deprivation quintile. This is the highest quintile, the most affluent people, all the way down to the poorest people, and plotted them by 5-year age groups, right across the age band. And you can reduce all the data on that slide to a single number that's representative of the steepness of the inequality slope. And you do that by subtracting the best from the worst and dividing it by the mean. And you come up with a single number that represents just how steep it is. And you then plot that. And you can see, I was flabbergasted when he showed me this. You assume that inequality is due to inequality in death rates from the common causes of death like heart disease and cancer. But heart disease and cancer affects older people. And what we're seeing here is that inequality in death rates is a feature of younger people. It shoots up in the teenage years, it's at its highest in the 30s, and it starts to come down in the late 40s. That's not heart disease and cancer that's causing that. And he proved that by looking at these causes of death, like heart disease, and doing slope index of inequality figures for heart disease by each 5-year age band. And when you plot that, you can see heart disease is a very minor contributor to inequality, and it happens in old age. So what's causing that big bulge amongst younger people? It's drugs, alcohol, suicide, and deaths from violence and accidents. Drugs, alcohol, suicide, and violence, we're not going to fix that by reducing the saturated fat content of the diet. This is socially determined. It's determined by interactions people have with each other, and that's not straightforward to fix. The idea that we come along like Banting and Best did, discover insulin, give it to people dying of type 1 diabetes and they'll be cured. No, this is much more complex. Just a word about the booze. So this slide shows the top line there is the highest death rate any country reached, of our 16 Western European countries reached, from death rates from alcoholic liver disease since 1950. The bottom line is the lowest death rate any country reached, and the thick line in the middle is the average death rates of any country since 1950s, deaths from alcoholic liver disease. And usually, when I ask an audience where they think Scotland was in the 1950s, they will say it's somewhere down below, above average, okay? Would that be what you would think? Well, that's where Scotland was in the 1950s and 60s. Way below average. Why? If you think about the Scots culture with alcohol in the 50s and 60s, not that I can remember it, but it was basically who drank? Men drank. What did they drink? Beer. Where did they drink it? In the pub. And when did they drink it? On a Friday night after work. Okay? From 70 to 90, it did like that. And then from 1990, for both men and women, it went from being below average to being the highest in the space of a decade and a half, because the culture had changed. Who drinks now? Everybody drinks. What do they drink? Seems to me like it's everything they can get their hands on. When do they drink it? 7 days a week. And where do they drink it? Everywhere, all over the place. It's a different culture. So culture is having a huge impact on this widening inequality. Culture associated with alcohol, but potentially with other things as well. And that whole picture was described for a time as the Glasgow Effect, and I didn't like that. I didn't like my home city being labelled in that way, as if there was something in the water or something in the, a miasma in the air that made things worse here. And my explanation for this was essentially that Glasgow got austerity 50 years before anyone else. When the shipyards began to shut down in the 50s and 60s, and the steelworks and the locomotive works and so on began to disappear, and at the same time they were knocking down all the traditional housing, sending people out to new houses, disturbing the social networks. It just seemed to me that those changes were more than people could cope with. So for a time I've blamed it on austerity, and now over the past year or two that view is being vindicated. This slide is a study carried out by a guy called Angus Deaton, a Scot, Nobel Prize winning economist who works at Princeton, and his wife Anne Case. They showed that between the year 2000 and 2012, amongst white, non-Hispanic, 50-year-olds in America who were blue-collar workers, they weren't college graduates, over those 12 years, there was a 240% increase in deaths from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. Exactly the same as we've seen in Glasgow. And the Brookings Institute in Washington mapped where those death rates, the greatest increase in those death rates were. That was the picture in 2000. That's what it looked like in 2014. The black areas are the counties that were most likely to vote for Donald Trump. So Case and Deaton labelled these as deaths of despair. These were blue-collar workers working in coal mines and steelworks and so on, car factories in Detroit and so on. They lost their jobs, they lost their health care, they lost their pensions, they turned to drink, drugs, and they decided to vote for a madman because existing politics had left them high and dry. And we're seeing the same thing in a number of other places, and I could not possibly comment on what's going on south of the border especially. But, you know, people are turning to folk. Well, don't start me. And we're now also seeing this elsewhere in the UK. Men and women, improvements in life expectancy for more or less, except for during wartime, for the past 100 years, every year has seen a substantial increase in life expectancy in men and women, except since the year round about 2010, where we're now beginning to see a decline in growth in life expectancy in the UK. It's data from the Financial Times. Annual growth in life expectancy has just disappeared. So, what's missing, I then concluded, was this notion of well-being and wellness. And this slide I got from a colleague in the Nordic Institute of Public Health, where they'd pulled together 25 different theories under this umbrella of the term of salutogenesis. Pathogenesis, the causes of disease. Salus was the Roman goddess of safety and well-being. And a number of them I'll just pick out. Emily Varner was an American psychologist who studied the health of children in a particular island in the Hawaiian archipelago that was notorious for its alcohol, its domestic violence, its child abuse and neglect and so on. And she looked to find out just exactly what was associated with success. She talked about resilience. What was it that produced resilience in the children? They were outgoing, positive in their attitude to life. They had a stable parent, at least one, and they had a cohesive community to live in. Those things were associated with kids who were doing well rather than the ones who were struggling. Corey Keyes, another American psychologist, his theory was flourishing, and it's very much the same. Happy and satisfied, see their lives as having a purpose, feel in control of their lives, they have some mastery over what they do, sense of growth, sense of autonomy, they choose their fate in terms of, instead of being victims of fate. Very similar conclusions to Emily Varner. It was when I came across Aaron Antonovsky that I began to see this in far more accurate detail. Antonovsky was an American sociologist who spent a lot of his time in Israel, where he studied the health of adults whose children had been in concentration camps. 70% of them were deeply damaged and had had very unsuccessful lives. Rather like Emily Varner, who also discovered a 70-30 split, the 30% that Antonovsky saw had survived, had what he described as a sense of coherence. And his sense of coherence was the ability to see the external environment round about you and the internal environment within yourself as being structured, predictable, explainable. They felt in control. They felt they had the internal resources required to meet the demands posed by these problems. And finally, that they saw the demands as challenges that they wanted to engage with. They had a sense of purpose. And Antonovsky went on to say, unless you had acquired a sense of coherence as a child, you would experience all the events round about you as stressful. You would experience chronic stress. Now, I was a surgeon, and a surgeon's job is to create acute stress in people. That's what a surgical operation is. It stimulates the body's stress response. And what Antonovsky was saying was that the environment that a child experiences in early life produces chronic stress. And I began to think, yeah, that begins to explain it. That begins to explain the physical consequences of social chaos. And when you look for it, you find evidence all over the place. This is Canadian data. The longer a child is in an orphanage, the higher its cortisol levels are. Cortisol being one of the key measures of an activated stress response. This is data from the UK Civil Service, where Sir Michael Marmot studied 30,000 civil servants over a long period. Cortisol levels are always highest in the morning and go down before you go to bed at night. Lower grade civil servants throughout the day have higher stress levels than higher grade civil servants. The least stressed person in any government department is the permanent secretary. Why? Because he's the boss, or she's the boss. And if a minister asks a permanent secretary to do something he or she doesn't fancy doing, what do? They just get someone else to do it. And if they don't fancy it, the next person down the line gets it. And eventually it goes all the way down to the person at the bottom of the hierarchy who gets all the rubbish no one else wants to do and has no one to hand it off to. So control is a critical element in all of this. So why would this sense of coherence, in Antonovsky's view, be so important in terms of activating the stress response, which, as we're going to see, is quite damaging? And I began to, the next step in understanding this came about when I saw this experiment in the psychology department of a New York university where they made baby monkeys depressed, okay? That's, on the left there, is not a happy baby monkey. All right, he's withdrawn, he's not engaged, etc. And what they did was, the way they did this was all down to the way they allowed mum to feed the baby. One half of the animal house, the food's there. Baby indicates he's hungry. Mum just bends down, stops swinging about the bars, bends down, picks up the food, feeds the baby. The other half of the animal house, they take the food away. They hide it. So when baby indicates he's hungry, mum has to leave baby. She has to go away and fight with other mums for access to the food. So she's absent for longer, and she's stressed by being absent. Now, if we're to ask you which group of babies do you think were stressed and depressed, would it be the one where mum's there all the time, or the one where mum's away for a large part of the time and is stressed by the experience? You would naturally think it's that second group, wouldn't you? Yeah? Anyone think it's the first group? No? Okay. When I ask that question, I can usually see some working mums in the audience looking a bit shifty and, uncomfortable and so on. Ladies, don't worry, it didn't make any difference. The green triangles there are where mum found it easy to feed the babies. That's the stress levels in the babies. The yellow triangles are the stress levels in the babies where mum found it hard to feed the babies and was away a lot, and they're the same. But the red triangles, they're the stress levels in the babies where they randomly changed the feeding pattern from one day to the next. It was not mum being there or mum not being there, it was baby not knowing. And if you think about the human equivalent of that, baby's born, feels hungry, cries, mum picks him up, cuddles him, talks to him, feeds him, stress resolved. There's a sort of tennis match, a serve and return starts. And by the time that exchange has happened 500, 1,000 times, baby knows, if I feel something a bit odd, I just do the crying thing, this mug comes along and fixes it, the world is structured, predictable, and I am in control. And contrast that to the experience of the baby, who when he cries sometimes gets fed, but sometimes doesn't, because mum's drunk, or under the influence of drugs, or mum's boyfriend picks the baby up and shakes him and slaps him because he doesn't know how to quieten a crying baby. Baby learns the world's not structured, it's not predictable, he's got no control, and if he does the one thing that he's programmed to do to attract attention to his needs, it hurts. So he becomes confused, uncertain, and that's problematic. And when they follow these babies up, not only are they depressed, but they have a metabolic change that allows them to store energy, because they've learned that the world is a threatening place, and their metabolism changes in a way that allows them to store energy, because they never know when they're going to have to run away or fight. This is a very much a kind of evolutionary type of response to uncertainty. The other thing that happens when babies experience high levels of stress is brain development goes down a different path in the stressed babies in 3 key areas. The prefrontal cortex does not develop such dense cellularity in the stressed babies. And the significance of that is that the prefrontal cortex is the seat of executive function. It's where you make your smart decisions. You take in new information, you process it, and you decide, that's what I'm going to do. It doesn't develop so well in the stressed babies. The hippocampus is the bit of brain that is most associated with memory, bring in new learning and storing it. The hippocampus is important in doing that. It does not develop so well. The hippocampus, this bit here, is smaller in volume in the stressed babies. And the other bit of the brain that becomes more active, bigger, more active, is the amygdala, which is the seat of emotion. And it's bigger in the stressed babies. So what you've got here are young animals, young humans, who are more anxious, aggressive, fearful, less well likely to respond appropriately in a stressful situation, and less well able to learn when they go to school. So when I talk to teachers, you tend to see them nodding a bit because they recognize the young guy in the class whose attendance isn't great, and he comes in not having slept and so on, and he's on a hair trigger, and if anyone annoys him, he's liable to reach out and punch them because they're bullying him because he's stupid. That pattern is what, to a greater or lesser extent, you see in children who come from families where there is inconsistent parenting. So we decided that we couldn't just take the experimental evidence as gospel. We actually went out and got a whole load of Glaswegians to volunteer to have their brain scanned. And I was a bit worried going down the East End of Glasgow and saying, hey mate, can we scan your brain? And I needn't have worried, because the response was almost always, what, you mean you're going to show me I've got a brain? Because these young men had always been told they were stupid. One guy even asked for a certificate to prove he had one. And, you know, this is a slide that's a section that's done to measure hippocampal volume and so on. And what you see in the depressed monkeys is exactly what you see in affluent and deprived individuals. That pattern is what you've got. And the final bit of the metabolic jigsaw here, my interest as a surgeon was the metabolic response to illnesses like cancer and infection and so on. So I'd done quite a lot of this before I went into public health. But we hadn't, epigenetics was was invented after I left surgery. The way in which the chronic elevation of the stress response occurs is because the stressed babies, or the inconsistently parented babies, do not develop a key part of the process that's required to suppress production of cortisol. And the key part that's missing is a thing called the glucocorticoid receptor gene. What happens when you cuddle a baby? The molecular biology of a hug, okay? When you cuddle a baby, possibly what happens when you cuddle me, but that depends on who's doing the cuddling, I have to say. Whenever someone feels comforted and happy, they tend to release from the brain a neurotransmitter called serotonin, or 5-hydroxytryptamine. The 5-HT circulates in the bloodstream. There's a transport mechanism that picks it up and takes it into the cell wall. And chromosome number 5 has a gene on it, the glucocorticoid receptor gene, which is activated when it comes into contact with serotonin. So in order for a baby to be able to produce the mechanism that's required to switch off cortisol production, he needs, at least for part of the time, to feel happy and contented. So we now know and understand a process by which neglect, inconsistency in early life leads to a changing personality as the brain develops in a particular direction. So by this stage, I realized that well-being is far more complex than we thought. There is no soft, simple solution to fixing it. There's no tablet that you're going to take that fixes this. Governments don't have a method for improvement that's appropriate to it yet. To change a complex system, you really need a method for improvement. And I say governments don't have it. Actually, I think we do. But we'll maybe mention that later on. And what we're seeing is the problems of inequality are simply getting worse. Life expectancy growth is declining. Inequality is widening. We need to get a grip of this. This is in the same league as the climate emergency in terms of the way in which our fabric of our society is beginning to fall apart. And you see things like the Adverse Childhood Experiences study from California, a study carried out in middle-class children. If you were a member of this study was done by Kaiser Permanente, and the Kaiser Permanente healthcare system is for middle-class people. But the study started off as a weight reduction clinic, and Vincent Felitti, the guy who started it, began to probe into what was happening in people who were not losing weight, and he finally discovered that they had a variety of problems in childhood. And so he started asking consistently about 9 different types of adverse event in a child's life, and found that, for example, 4 or more adverse events in a child's life made them 8 times more likely to become alcoholics, about 12 times more likely to become narcotics abusers. Boys who experience physical violence at the hands of an older male, 8 times more likely to engage in partner violence when they grew up, about 5 times more likely to be arrested for carrying weapons. The Dunedin cohort in the South Island of New Zealand, 1,000 children identified about 40 odd years ago, followed up since then. The children at age 3 who were identified as living in chaotic circumstances in their 40s, they're more likely to be unemployed, have criminal convictions, especially for violence, experience teenage pregnancy, be substance misusers, and their metabolic problems are exhibited by the fact that they've got increased risk of type 2 diabetes, etc. So there's now shed loads of evidence that shows that the way in which you are born and nurtured can predict your ability to make decisions appropriately about your life. And this idea that politicians have that, oh, these folk that get into trouble, they're just a bad lot, they're just making bad decisions, blah, blah, blah. That's the way they were made, not the decisions they have freely taken. And whenever I used to go to the Hollywood Health Committee or sometimes the Finance Committee, I'd talk about the need to support families. And if you're a Labour member, if you're on the left of centre, I'd express that as an issue of social justice. And to try and get the Tories on side, I'd say, and of course, if you support families, the children will be engaged with school, they'll do well at school, they won't go to jail, they'll get jobs, and they'll pay taxes. What's not to like, guys? Okay? This is something that is important for all of us. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study in California, they calculated that 1 year's worth of child neglect, so a cohort born in a single year, over their lifetime, that cohort will cost the American economy $124 billion, both in terms of the additional cost of services and the fact that they never get jobs and pay taxes, and the services that are additional are the costs of keeping them in jail and so on. So, well-being. The traditional way of thinking about well-being is look at outcomes as defined medically. Type 2 diabetes, chronic lung disease and so on, and they're all due to behaviours, they're due to choices people make, and people used to talk about health literacy and so on, if only they knew and understood. When I was a surgeon at the Royal Infirmary, I used to see patients coming in with things like, recurrently with things like alcohol-based pancreatitis or bleeding peptic ulcer, and you'd say to them, look, John, it's the fourth time you've been in with us. If you don't stop drinking, you're going to die. And they'd look at me as if I was daft. Of course, I know that. Well, why do you keep doing it? Well, life's crap. And the booze is the only pleasure I've got in life. They're not stupid. So this notion that if they don't stop smoking, shout at them, and if they still don't stop smoking, shout at them even louder, is not going to work. It's all down to creating the ability to make a positive choice in your life. And that comes from having a sense of purpose, a sense of control, a sense of self-esteem, and having supportive societal networks round about you. Well-being. That's my definition of well-being. Another problem that we've had in public health is Maslow's hierarchy of human need. Many people will have heard of Maslow's hierarchy. Basically, Maslow says that if you want to get to this level of self-actualization at the top here, creativity, spontaneity, solving problems, all that kind of thing, you need to have, first of all, certain basic things below you, like access to food, water, security, friendship, family, etc. You go up this hierarchy and eventually you reach self-actualization. Folk have heard of Maslow before, yeah? Maslow was an idiot, okay? Complete and utter idiot in what he did. This is my version of Maslow's hierarchy, okay? All that other stuff comes after self-actualization. And it finally dawned on me after talking to lots and lots of organizations that transform people's lives. What they do is they help people to become self-actualized. They help them to be in control, to be creative and so on. And then they make the decisions about their well-being. So I typed in one day, Maslow was wrong, into the internet, and I got shed loads of things back, including this interesting one. In 1938, Maslow visited a Blackfoot Indian reservation in Alberta. And they drew for him a teepee. That's where he got his triangle from. And they said, the most important thing is to have our children feeling in control of their lives. Because if they grow up to be in control of their lives, the community is in control of its future, and that ensures cultural stability and perpetuity, which of course for indigenous populations is the important thing. But Maslow took that and he put self-actualization at the top because he was influenced by the economic thinking of the time. The most important thing is the ability to be in control of your life. So he put that as the pinnacle of his triangle. And he was completely wrong. And he's influenced thinking all these years. You start with self-actualization. And where you have problems, where you have done a lot of work with the violence reduction unit, seen lots and lots of young men get into trouble. Some of my best friends now have done time for things like attempted murder and so on, because they've turned out to be really, really nice, good people who have experienced horrible things, and they want to go and help others avoid what they've experienced. Self-actualization can come in at any time. So what we've seen, what I think is happening in our society, what I think the Glasgow Effect is, chaotic early years in houses that have been affected by poverty, by lack of jobs, by social chaos and so on. The children experiencing that are labelled as having mental health problems. They have behavioural problems, they're emotionally unmanageable and so on. They go to school and they fail. And they get excluded from school, and they go around the shopping centre and they get a bottle of booze or whatever, they get into a fight and they go to jail. And I go to jail a lot. Most of the time they let me out. And you ask the 18-year-old, okay, John, you're about to get out, what are you going to do when you get out? I'll never get a job, I've got a criminal record. So what are you going to do? I'll sit at home, I'll watch telly, and I'll drink. They have that lack of self-esteem, lack of any sense of self-efficacy. And what they never factor into the equation is the girlfriend will have a baby who will be born into a chaotic home, and the intergenerational cycle perpetuates. We've got to break that cycle. And there are organisations out there that are doing that. First one that I ever really realised was doing this was Alcoholics Anonymous. But there's a whole load of others that are doing it in different ways. Prolonged non-judgmental relationship. I'm here to help you. I've been where you've been. This is what the guys in the violence reduction unit, I've been where you've been. I've been in jail. I've done bad things. But I know it doesn't have to be like that. Come on, we'll go and we'll have a coffee and we'll talk about it. And they're there for them. So it builds trust. The individual begins to realise, well, this is someone that I respect, and he's showing concern for me, therefore I need to respect myself. So I need to make some choices. He's supported while he realigns his life, and they always come back to want to support others. So it's the interaction between the individual and the people supporting him as the critical change agent in all of this. And I can give you hundreds of anecdotes about how that has happened. Now, just to give you a couple of project suggestions, the Broadway experiment in the City of London, 13 rough sleepers who'd been sleeping under bridges and in doorways for between 4 and 45 years. Unbelievable. 45 years must be close to being the life expectancy of a rough sleeper. City of London were spending a fortune on them in terms of service costs. They decided to do something differently. They decided to set up 13 bank accounts, put £3,000 in each bank account. They gave these individuals a mentor, and the mentor was acting on the basis of, what do you need to live a better life? Not, I'm here to tell you what you need. What do you think you need? The first guy she spoke to asked for a new pair of spectacles, because he liked to read the newspapers that folk threw away. Second guy asked for a hearing aid. The most expensive thing anyone asked for was a guy who said the only time in his life he'd ever been happy was as a boy, when his parents used to take him on holiday to a caravan park in Kent. Could they see if there was a vacant caravan, a second-hand caravan he could buy, and he'd go and live in it. A year after this process started, 11 of the 13 were in permanent accommodation. A couple of them had jobs, and the average spend from each of the bank accounts was £780. You put your hand out to someone, you put your arm round them, they're not going to take the mickey. They're going to respond appropriately. That left-wing rag, The Economist, decided that the most efficient way to spend money on the homeless might be to give it to them. And various other studies in the US particularly have shown exactly the same thing. Beacon and Old Hill Estate, an estate and housing estate of about 3,000 people in Falmouth and Devon, went from having full employment, the men in Naval Dockyard, to having no employment when the dockyard shut down. Over a few years, it became a war zone. Literally, they were firebombing each other's cars, they were smashing houses and all this kind of thing. The police withdrew. A few years later, the Chief Constable made a formal apology to the people of Beacon and Old Hill for having let them down. Those results were produced by 2 health visitors. One time after a health visit, one of the health visitors was so disgusted, this wee girl had a whole series of pet rabbits, and someone broke into the hutch and threw these rabbits onto a bonfire while she was watching. And she was so disgusted that she and her fellow health visitor sent leaflets round 50 households and said, we're going to have a meeting to see what we can do to change this place. 5 people turned up. Those 5 people and those 2 health visitors produced that series of results over the next years by going out to people and saying, what would make your life better? And it started off, the general conclusion was, well, let's try and tidy the place up. It's a real tip. So they decided to get gardening equipment, and they decided to hack, and the gardens hadn't been tended for years. And Hazel, one of the health visitors, told me once that the first street they started to hack down the bushes in and so on, one of the first gardens they tackled, they uncovered a long forgotten Ford Transit van in the front garden of this house. That's how overgrown they were. And the people began to see that change was possible, and they got in and they created amazing transformation. One of the 5 people became mayor of Falmouth. John Prescott at the time was development minister and so on. One of the other 5 people became his special advisor and so on. These were folk who were really on their uppers, but they took control. So the point about the brain changes here is that it's not brain damage, it's brain that develops in response to a pattern of experience. And my friend Bruce McEwen in Columbia University in New York, who described some of these brain changes initially, reasoned that if they went down that pathway in the light of adversity, what would you have to do in later life to restore the original and preferred structures? So he's done a study in people aged 35 to 55 using these 3 approaches. Physical activity to increase brain blood flow reverses the changes in the hippocampus. It increases hippocampal volume. Mindfulness, meditation, decreased the activity in the amygdala, and social support and integration in a community, the friendship and so on that came from the kind of projects that we know about, improves prefrontal cortex blood flow, improves executive decision making, and overall health improves. What he told me the last time I spoke to him was that structurally the brains look normal after a period of this. So we have a pattern of biological consequences of adverse experiences, that you change those experiences, you reverse the adverse biology, even into people in their 50s. The problem we have with our society is that our existing system is very rational. We identify problems and we define people by their problems. So we set up a system to fix their problems for them. We do things to people whose problem is they lack a sense of control. And we come along and we enhance that. As just back from Australia, you would not believe what these morons in the Australian government have just done. They have just changed their benefits system to give people, particularly Indigenous people a credit card. So they don't get cash, they get a card. This card can only be used to buy food and cleaning products. You cannot buy alcohol, you cannot buy a whole list of things you cannot buy with this. So they completely take away choice from people. The only money they've got, they say, we'll decide what you can spend your money on. It's inhuman. I just couldn't believe it when I heard it. So the purpose of our society, of our structures, there's targets and indicators and budgets and all that kind of stuff. Whatever you do, don't let the organisation get into trouble. So it's the organisation that's of first importance. What so many organisations are now trying to do is ask people, what do you need to live a good life? Look for strength in those people, help them determine their own solutions, and the citizen becomes the main agent of the new structure. Build strong citizens, strong communities, and you will not have the kind of problems I've outlined. Where we have been and where we are at the moment in many agencies is the left-hand curve there, the new public management, the targets, performance management being the buzzword. With our patient safety programme and our early years collaborative in Scotland, we've moved into the quality improvement area where we share power with frontline staff. Patient safety programme, early years collaborative, was designed by the people working with citizens. What we need to do now is move into the right-hand lane where we actually cede power to citizens. And this is where the digital stuff comes in, I think. How do we create data flows? How do we create interventions and so on that allow people to feel more in control of their lives? The danger I see with data is that you hand it over to folk who are already quite in control of their lives, and we miss out on those that are struggling. We have to make sure we have to reach the people who are in need most, and that is designing the solutions in partnership with them. And just to finish with a couple of quotes, most folk in the audience will know who he is. Jimmy Reid, communist shop steward, 1970, the Heath government were going to shut down shipbuilding on the Clyde. Jimmy Reid stopped them by taking them workers in, and the Upper Clyde shipbuilders work-in took place. And every night the TV cameras would go along, and Jimmy would be flaying into the government. He was such a fabulous orator that the government, Ted Heath's government, eventually gave up, gave them the money they needed, and then still shipbuilding on the Clyde to a certain degree. I was a medical student in 1971 when we elected Jimmy Reid Lord Rector of Glasgow University. His rectorial address was reprinted in full in the New York Times, which called it the single most important public speech since the Gettysburg Address. And to those of us who were in the room that day, that comparison of Jimmy Reid with Abraham Lincoln was immensely flattering to Abraham Lincoln. It was amazing, spellbinding. It was about alienation, the cry of men who feel themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control, the frustration of ordinary people excluded from the processes of decision making, the feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel with justification they have no say in shaping or determining their own destinies. The day before the independence referendum, the National Theatre of Scotland had an event up on the Mound, and they had all sorts of folk. They had Ricky Ross from Deacon Blue there and all this kind of thing, singers and poets and so on. And they asked me to go along and give Jimmy Reid's speech. And I could hardly get through it for greeting. It was just so good. But Jimmy Reid saw what was happening in West Central Scotland as people lost their jobs and were being pushed to the fringes of society. And the solution is to reverse that alienation. We have to get our feet wet. And what I tell frontline staff is, just do what people need. Don't do what your boss tells you. Take risks. And I'll give you an example. A housing officer was telling me recently, she had a tenant who who had moved some months previously into this house. He'd moved out of the area of the previous, his Department of Work Pensions thing. His benefits were stopped because he'd moved from one area, and then in the area he'd moved into, they hadn't had authorization to pay him his benefits for several months, and he hadn't been paying his rent. So he was looking at eviction, homelessness. And she said, look, what's the issue? He said, well, I'm not working. So what's the problem with working? He'd had some problems, health problems. He'd been a taxi driver. He'd had to give up while the health problems were being solved, and he'd lost his license. So what do you need to get your license back? Well, it costs £250. I'll be back. She went away, got £250, gave him £250, got his license back, started earning money again. Everybody happy. He was able to pay his own way. Another story from the Wheatley Group. Chairman of the Wheatley Group, the chief executive of the Wheatley Group, asked to go and see a woman who had, a local councillor said, this woman is suicidal. She's going to kill herself if she doesn't get help. So Martin said he was in the room for about 5 minutes with her when he diagnosed the problem. The problem was she had 2 autistic children who were really unmanageable, and they had to be kept in the house under her feet 24/7, because if she let them out of the house, they'd wander away and get lost, which was even more stressful. And the reason they would wander away and get lost was because there was no fence around the garden. So Martin got hold of the housing officer and said, what about this fence? Oh, I know about the fence, but I can't build it until I get a health and safety assessment. Martin said, build the fence. Oh, no, I can't do it. Build a bloody fence. Fence built, problem solved. The Wheatley Group now has a program called Think Yes. If a member of the public comes to you, doesn't matter if you're the chairman of the Wheatley Group or the receptionist in the office or whatever, if a person comes to you with a problem, you take responsibility for fixing the problem. You don't send them to the office down the road. You don't give them a phone number or an email address to contact, because if they're chaotic, they're overwhelmed by something else to do. And the end result of that was, after running this for a few years, the housing ombudsman came up from England and said, a housing organisation this size, I would expect 300 complaints a year. Last year you had none. I want to know what's happening. Do the right thing for people. It saves money in the long run, and it's the right thing to do. And if we do that, if we look after our children well, if we get our children engaged early on by showing them concern and compassion and all that kind of, and supporting their families, you will get wonderful results, as you can see by this picture, which is of my youngest granddaughter. You can't get better than that. Okay, right, that's me. Thanks very much. 5 minutes.
Grab a seat. That was fantastic, wasn't it? Yes. Right, I'll let you get your breath back, because that was awesome. And in the Menti app, if you get your phones out, there's a few questions, and we've also asked you some words that spring to mind about the talk that we've just heard. So we're going to switch to that.
Oh dear.
Here we go. Awesome, inspiring, thought-provoking, challenging. No prompt in the audience now. So we're going to keep capturing those. And there's also, once you've done that, there's another section, and we'll come back to those as you add them in. There's a few questions around digital tools. Do you think digital tools can free up time for face-to-face interaction in health and care, make accessing services more convenient for citizens, and make access more equitable for all citizens? But we'll come back to that in a sec, because I think the most important thing is to give you a chance to ask some questions. So I'm going to start with one while they're just getting to grips with those questions, but I was taken by the work on control, and giving people back control. One of the biggest challenges of digital technology, and in particular social media, is our young people and the mental health implications of the fact that actually these, they become phone zombies. And the lack of control and the stressors they are now getting from social media. How do you think we can start to address some of that? I think because it is stressors.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. If I did know the answer to that, I'd be making a fortune somewhere on the internet, obviously. But young people are obsessed with this because they've got nothing else to occupy them. Is it sport? Is it reading books or whatever you might? So we need to give them challenges. We need to give them alternatives to this. I mean, I have a daughter, my youngest daughter's a student at the Conservatoire. She's a film student, and she's making a shed load of money with all these YouTubers wanting her to edit their movies and all this kind of thing. So there is a huge industry out there that is attracting lots of attention, and I don't think we can just ban it. I don't think we can say, right, this is rubbish and so on. It's there, it's happening, but you got to get a balance, and the balance would be, for me, staying active, staying engaged, interacting with my mates down the pub or whatever. And I just... so if children have their noses in this all the time, it's a sure sign that they don't have a broader set of interests available to them. They've been too narrowly defined. And I think I think schools especially, and parents have to be helped to understand that and encourage them to do different things. I mean, there's Lila reading her book. Can't get better than that.
Can she explain quantum yet?
Oh, she tells. I know so much more about quantum computing after talking to her. She's now 15 months.
Fantastic. Right, so I'm going to open it up to the audience because it'd be, one of the reasons you're here is to get engaged. So do you have any questions? I think we've got a couple of microphones as well. So, all right. Have you got a loud voice, sir?
Roughly,
yeah.
I'll speak up. I was struck by what you were talking about social disintegration and addiction coming as a result of that. And I was struck about the rat park experiments from Alexander Bruce. So with the rats that they gave cocaine to, they took cocaine forever until they died. But when they gave them fun, colourful toys to play with, and they lived more productive lives. The other thing was about unemployment, and having just come through a spell of unemployment myself, I understand kind of the social distance that can create. I wonder what your thoughts are about the oncoming digital revolution with driverless cars and the joblessness that might create. And do you think that universal basic income might be an appropriate solution to that?
So one of the other things that keeps me busy is I'm a member of the First Minister's Council of Economic Advisors. And one of the themes there that we're working on is the notion of inclusive economic growth. GDP basically measures production and consumption. It doesn't, as Robert Kennedy says, it measures everything that's everything that's important except that which makes life worth living. So we're trying to come up with an alternative way of encouraging economic growth. And what I'm interested in just now, there's this idea that's emerged again from Washington, D.C. of the democratic economy, an economy that people control, not corporations who are only interested in their shareholders. So they'll go into a community, they'll suck out all the labour from that community, the money goes back to their shareholders, and then when the money dries up, they just walk away, leaving destitution. Whereas the democratic economy is about people coming together who have skills to create small community-based enterprise, and the money stays and circulates in the community. And you know, this organisation, the Democratic Collaborative, is writing a lot about that now, and that feels to me to be a way forward, a way to deliver this inclusive economic growth thing, and a way of engaging young people in doing positive things. We're working with New Zealand on this kind of thing. 1 or 2 other countries are involved in this thing that we're calling the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So we in Scotland are thinking about alternatives that might answer your questions here. The thought of, you know, Amazon and Netflix and so on growing ever bigger, I find very depressing. So we just have to find a suitable alternative.
Great. Any other questions? Oh, we've got one at the back there. I think we might need the mic.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting topics and presentation. Thank you for that. I'm interested in the data where you showed different countries and the impacts of, but that's mostly a Western country. Has there been any, whether the conclusion is still the same for the non-Western country where when the drugs and alcohol is not become a culture? Yeah.
By non-Western countries, do you mean?
Asia.
Okay,
For
Asia.
example.
So no, that's for high-income countries, basically, that data. And I haven't been able to get data for Asia, Far East, that kind of thing. It's there. World Bank, I recently saw some World Bank stuff on this, but I haven't quite incorporated that into the thinking. I'm absolutely certain that what you're seeing going on in Hong Kong and so on just now will alienate people. It has done. So we're seeing this kind of disintegration as people try to suck power to themselves, and individual citizens are left behind and feeling powerless. Doesn't matter where it is, whether it's Africa, Asia, whatever. I'm not seeing too many countries just now who are behaving very cleverly in terms of the sharing of power with citizens. There are some, undoubtedly, but we need to increase the number that are doing that.
Okay, just over here on the right-hand side.
Thank you very much. It was a great presentation. Today, just thinking back about some of the things that we're hearing today and reflecting back on trying to give patients control of their data resonates with me with what you're saying about giving citizens control.
Yeah.
And that will help them manage their health better. And also, I do wonder in terms of paradigm shifts where we think, I was only here today, so I was only able to see so much of this conference, but quite a lot of it's about health care.
Everyone, and welcome.
And are we really focusing enough digital on well-being?
Okay.
And how can we really progress that?
Okay, so the first point about giving patients control of their data and access to their data, there's an organisation which is mainly down south called PKB, Patients Know Best, and basically they've contracted with a number of big health authorities in England, and they've got a system by which people can download their own health data. And from looking at it, what I think is happening is it's more affluent people who are most interested in that. What the company tells me, the one bit in Glasgow that they're involved with is the sexually transmitted diseases group, because people with HIV and AIDS want to know their blood counts the day that, so they are very motivated to get the results very quickly and so on. But people who are living difficult lives are less interested in this sort of thing, and less able to act on it. So if we are going to do that, we need to find ways of engaging people at the lower end of the social scale and helping them understand what it's about, and helping them to act positively in response to the information they're getting. So I think that's a real issue about handing over that sort of data. Let's make sure everyone can benefit from it equally.
Okay, next. Margaret down the front here.
Yeah, well, Harry will hear me from here. That was great, Harry. Thank you so much. I think it was a real sort of useful, I think, just lifting us up a bit and thinking about health and well-being. And I guess from what I've been reflecting on over the last few days, and we've heard some fantastic examples of how digital is facilitating social connectedness, and there is a lot of the terminology you were using, like control and confidence and safety, esteem. I mean, those are things that we are beginning to use in the context of, if digital is deployed as an enabler, can help. And I think the challenge, I guess, for us is to look at it in its round, and to look at some of those issues about inequalities, because I think we have seen some good evidence that it can support well-being. I think the point around, are we focusing enough on prevention? We had a fantastic session today with young Scott, so I think it's very clear when you engage with young people, that how they want to access a new services isn't how we might think they want to access a new services. So I suppose for me, the big take-home message from what you've said, I think, is that co-production, and I think it's moving into that new system. And I was looking at the list of things you had on that slide, the existing system and the new system, and saying, actually, if we can capture how digital can contribute, it's not going to be the panacea. And I think we all have to be aware that, we can't just plug something in and say, that's fine. But I think if we can capture that new system and begin to see how can digital be an enabler, to support that, because digital is here, it's in our day-to-day lives. It needs to be within our health and care space as well. But we've got a real opportunity, I suppose, to try and look at how we integrate it in a needs-based way. And I think that co-design, co-production, again, some fantastic examples of that as well. We need to do a lot more, but it's how we capture and build that into that new system.
Yeah. So organisations like Glasgow Life, for example, that run the libraries and the gyms and swimming pools and so on in Glasgow, you've got a swipe card that you need to get in. And I spoke to them and I said, look, do you collect any data from this? And the guy I spoke to wasn't sure if they did. But that's a way, ordinary people in Glasgow, who's got these cards, who's using them, what are they using them for, and all that kind of stuff. One caveat, Vitality, people heard of Vitality, the insurance, it incentivizes people to, it gives you an Apple Watch or something if you buy insurance from them and so on. I once spoke to one of their data guys who said yes, they put things in people's cars that tell them how well they're driving and so on if you get car insurance. He says yes, we're looking at physical activity scores and all the people we insure and so on. And he said, I'm now also thinking about an honesty score, because he says sometimes we follow people, their cars drive up to the gym, and we see them swiping into the gym, and then 2 minutes later their car drives away because they get points for going to the gym. So, there are all sorts of perverse incentives in all of this, and the trick is going to be to design things appropriately. But there's lots of data out there that could be used, and lots of data that could be used for public benefit. And therefore, we should be making the arguments that the public benefit, in many cases, the benefit to the individual, in many cases, justifies the privacy issues that are involved. So I just would like to see a lot more creativity about what's happening.
Okay, I'm very conscious that we are now over
it's
10
my tea
minutes,
time.
and you're still in Australia time, aren't you?
I'm still in Australia
So it's 4 in the morning. He's doing quite well. One final question. So the gentleman here with the white shirt, and then we'll let you all get home and let you get to your bed.
I was struck by what you said about when people don't behave themselves and you used to shout at them. Well, maybe you didn't, but some of your colleagues might have done. I was thinking about the way that I'm treated when I go to my GP surgery. And it's the usual thing about the appointments, I'll not bother rehearsing that. I'm not allowed to take more than one problem to the GP. If I've got 2 problems, I've got lots of problems, I've got to book another appointment. I can sit and wait for probably about an hour and a half to get my results back for the wee x-ray I've just recently had in my hand. And, I can't bring myself to do that. I'll get round to it in the next week or 2. But the other thing is there's no soap in the toilets, because apparently everybody keeps stealing it. And they're not going to put any in.
Are you going to tell us which surgery this is?
It wouldn't be fair, would it? But it's Princess Street in Dundee. I'll maybe better not go back there now. But the last thing is that no one has ever asked me what I think about the service that I get at that surgery. The doctors are great, actually. They're very good. They're very competent. When you actually get in the door, after you've had your name publicly called out into the waiting room, then it's fine. But everything up to that point is just horrible and reminds me of the old Labour Exchange in Galloway Street that I used to sign on.
Okay.
So how can we just change the culture?
So there are lots of GPs doing some very interesting things. My wife, for example, she, instead of having a receptionist answer the phone first thing in the morning, a doctor does it. And the doctor gives advice to the person who phones in. The pharmacist will deal with this. There's a physiotherapist in such and such a place, all this kind of thing. As a result, instead of having 10-minute appointments, she's able to offer, on the same day you call in, people half-hour appointments. So if folk come with complex problems, she's able to tackle those often at the first attempt. And it's made it much easier for them. Literally the number of folk who phone in but don't come, she's half the number of people who come in by 50%, so that the people who actually need to see the doctor get far more time with them. And so we need to be thinking much more about systems change, I think. We need to be thinking about she will send off a specimen in the morning and she gets the result back by mid-afternoon and she'll phone you or whatever. So the systems are all there that allow this to happen if the doctor is prepared to think about it and try it. One of the key things about the collaboratives was small tests of change. Plan, do, study, act things. If you've got an idea, test it, see what the result is, and implement it if it works, and tell everyone if it works so that they spread the learning. And if it doesn't work, tell everyone it didn't work so they don't make the same mistake. So I'm thinking that we're going to need a collaborative, a well-being collaborative in Scotland that allows people to come up with clever ideas and spread the learning. It's just if I can persuade colleagues in various buildings in Edinburgh to get in behind it. And I'm not, the nicest thing the First Minister ever said about me was she once told a meeting that my management style was proceed until apprehended. And I'm very proud of that, because that's what I advocate. Better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Do the right thing and tell everyone if it works, and spread that learning.
Yeah. I've heard another version of that is keep running until you're tasered. So can I all ask you all to a huge round of applause for Sir Harry to keep running until you're tasered. Thanks for staying a little bit late. I hope you really enjoyed it, and safe travels home. Thank you.